Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell you scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse wherever you stream podcasts. Just be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. When I was a kid, my dad loved telling scary stories, and there's one in particular that creeped me out more than others. It didn't happen to him, but rather his uncle, who while walking home one night, turned the corner and walked into a man who was coming in the other direction. At first he thought he was being attacked, so he pushed the man, who pushed him back. The two then stopped and exchanged apologies. But then my great-uncle noticed something strange. The build and voice of the man looked and sounded familiar. The man looked and sounded just like him. Noticing he was looking down, my great-uncle started a conversation, hoping to get him to look up. It worked, and within a second or two, my great-uncle came face to face with himself. The eyes, nose, mouth, wrinkled forehead, hairline, all of it belonged to him. Except it also belonged to this man who was standing in front of him. My great-uncle, too scared to walk away, stumbled over his words and started asking questions. Who are you? What is your name? When is your birthday? Who are your parents? Do you have siblings? The man had the same name, same birthday, same parents, and same brothers. Startled, he kept the conversation going for another minute before saying goodbye. The man nodded, and the two turned to walk away in the direction they were originally going. A few steps in, my great-uncle looked back, to find the man was nowhere to be found. He took off running, and upon getting home, told his parents and brothers about what happened, and until the day he died, he firmly believed he had met his twin. But it sounds like he met his doppelganger. The concept of mimics and doppelgangers is unsettling and horrifying. The idea that we can encounter someone, or something, that can mime our bodies, words, and looks is the stuff of nightmares. Except according to some accounts, there's one case that may have actually brought the nightmare into reality. In 1845, French teacher Emilie Sagee may have had a doppelganger that was witnessed by an entire classroom of children. And to say it scared the hell out of them is an understatement. And the story is much deeper than that. Something interesting. While researching for each episode, I always look for primary sources. Eyewitness testimony, court transcripts, medical examiner's notes, things like that. But for this story, all I could find were second and third-hand summaries. Except I knew they had to have come from somewhere. Emilie Sagee didn't just appear out of nowhere. Or maybe she did. With a little digging, I struck gold. A book entitled Footfalls on the Boundary of Another World, written by Robert Dale Owen. Towards the end of chapter 3, he tells the story of Emilie Sagee. And since the book was published in 1860, two things are true. He wrote the book less than 15 years after the events occurred, which is stunningly close time-wise. And the book is in the public domain, which means I'm going to tell the story of Emilie Sagee, not in a summary from second and third-hand sources, but from Robert Dale Owen's own pen. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the strange and scary doppelganger case of Emilie Sagee. What really happened at a school in 1845? And did she really have a doppelganger, or is there some other explanation? I'll share the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. There existed in the year 1845, and is still continued in Livonia, about 36 miles from Iga and a mile and a half from the small town of Volmar, an institution of high repute for the education of young ladies, entitled the Pensionnat of Neuvelka. It is under the superintendence of Moravian directors, of whom the principal, at the time of the occurrences about to be related, was named Buch. There were in that year 42 young ladies residing there as boarders, chiefly daughters of noble Livonian families. Among them, Mademoiselle Julie, second daughter of the Baron de Guldenstube, then 13 years of age. In this institution, one of the female teachers at that time was Mademoiselle Emilie Sagee, a French lady from Dijon. She was of the northern type, a blonde with very fair complexion, light blue eyes, chestnut hair, slightly above the middle size, and of slender figure. In character, she was amiable, quiet, and good-tempered, not at all given to anger or impatience, but of an anxious disposition, and as to her physical temperament, somewhat nervously excitable. Her health was usually good, and during the year and a half that she lived as teacher at Neuvelka, she had but one or two slight indispositions. She was intelligent and accomplished, and the directors, during the entire period of her stay, were perfectly satisfied with her conduct, her industry, and her acquirements. She was at that time 32 years of age. A few weeks after Mademoiselle Sagee first arrived, singular reports began to circulate among the pupils. When some casual inquiry happened to be made as to where she was, one young lady would reply that she had seen her in such or such a room, whereupon another would say, "Oh no, she can't be there, for I have just met her on the stairway, or perhaps on some distant corridor." At first, they naturally supposed it was mere mistake, but as the thing recurred again and again, they began to think it very odd, and finally spoke to the other governesses about it. Whether the teachers at that time could have furnished an explanation or not, they gave none. They merely told the young ladies it was all fancy and nonsense, and bade them pay no attention to it. But after a time, things much more extraordinary, and which could not be set down to imagination or mistake, began to occur. One day, the governess was giving a lesson to a class of 13, of whom Mademoiselle de Guldenstube was one, and was demonstrating, with eagerness, some proposition, to illustrate which she had occasion to write with chalk on a blackboard. While she was doing so, and the young ladies were looking at her, to their consternation, they suddenly saw two Mademoiselle Sagees, the one by the side of the other. They were exactly alike, and they used the same gestures, only that the real person held a bit of chalk in her hand, and did actually write while the double had no chalk, and only imitated the motion. This incident naturally caused a great sensation in the establishment. It was ascertained, on inquiry, that every one of the 13 young ladies in the class had seen the second figure, and that they all agreed in their description of its appearance and of its motions. Soon after, one of the pupils, having obtained permission, with some others, to attend an event in the neighborhood, and being engaged in completing her toilet, Mademoiselle Sagee had good-naturedly volunteered her aid, and was hooking her dress behind. The young lady, happening to turn round and to look in an adjacent mirror, perceived two Mademoiselle Sagees hooking her dress. The sudden apparition produced so much effect upon her that she fainted. Months passed by, and similar phenomena were still repeated. Sometimes, at dinner, the double appeared standing behind the teacher's chair and imitating her motions as she ate, only that its hands held no knife and fork, and that there was no appearance of food. The figure alone was repeated. All the pupils and the servants waiting on the table witnessed this. It was only occasionally, however, that the double appeared to imitate the motions of the real person. Sometimes, when the latter rose from a chair, the figure would appear seated on it. On one occasion, Mademoiselle Sagee, being confined to bed with an attack of influenza, the young lady already mentioned was sitting by her bedside, reading to her. Suddenly, the governess became stiff and pale, and seeming as if about to faint, the young lady, alarmed, asked if she was worse. She replied that she was not, but in a very feeble and languid voice. A few seconds afterward, the pupil, happening to look round, saw quite distinctly the figure of the governess walking up and down the apartment. This time the young lady had sufficient self-control to remain quiet, and even to make no remark to the patient. Soon afterward, she came downstairs, looking very pale, and related what she had witnessed. We'll continue right after this quick ad break. But the most remarkable example of the seeming independent action of the two figures happened in this wise. One day, all the young ladies of the institution, to the number of 42, were assembled in the same room, engaged in embroidery. It was a spacious hall on the first floor of the principal building, and had 4 large windows, or rather glass doors, for they opened to the floor, giving entrance to a garden of some extent in front of the house. There was a long table in the center of the room, and here it was that the various classes were wont to unite for needlework or similar occupation. On this occasion, the young ladies were all seated at the table in question, whence they could readily see what passed in the garden. And while engaged at their work, they had noticed Mademoiselle Sagee was there, not far from the house, gathering flowers, of which she was very fond. At the head of the table, seated in an armchair, of green morocco my informant says, she still distinctly recollects that it was, sat another teacher in charge of the pupils. After a time, this lady had occasion to leave the room, and the armchair was left vacant. It remained so, however, for a short time only, for of a sudden there appeared seated in it the figure of Mademoiselle Sagee. The young ladies immediately looked into the garden, and there she still was, engaged as before. Only they remarked that she moved very slowly and languidly as a drowsy or exhausted person might. Again they looked at the armchair, and there she sat, silent and without motion, but to the sight so palpably real that had they not seen her outside in the garden, and had they not known that she appeared in the chair without having walked into the room, they would all have supposed that it was the lady herself. As it was being quite certain that it was not a real person, and having become to a certain extent familiar with this strange phenomenon, 2 of the boldest approached and tried to touch the figure. They reported that they did feel a slight resistance, which they likened to that which a fabric of fine muslin or crepe would offer to the touch. One of the 2 then passed close in front of the armchair, and actually threw a portion of the figure. The appearance, however, remained after she had done so, for some time longer, still seated as before. At last it gradually disappeared, and then it was observed that Mademoiselle Sagee resumed, with all her usual activity, her task of flower gathering. Every one of the 42 pupils saw the same figure in the same way. Some of the young ladies afterward asked Mademoiselle Sagee if there was anything peculiar in her feelings on this occasion. She replied that she had recollected this only, that happening to look up and perceiving the teacher's armchair to be vacant, she had thought to herself, "I wish she had not gone away. These girls will be sure to be idling their time and getting into some mischief." This phenomenon continued, under various modifications, throughout the whole time that Mademoiselle Sagee retained her situation at Neuvelka, that is, throughout a portion of the years 1845 and 1846, and in all, for about a year and a half, at intervals, however, sometimes intermitting for a week, sometimes for several weeks at a time. It seemed chiefly to present itself on occasions when the lady was very earnest or eager in what she was about. It was uniformly remarked that the more distinct and material to the sight the double was, the more stiff and languid was the living person. And in proportion as the double faded, did the real individual resume her powers. She herself, however, was totally unconscious of the phenomenon. She had first become aware of it only from the report of others, and she usually detected it by the looks of the persons present. She never herself saw the appearance, nor seemed to notice the species of rigid apathy which crept over her at the times it was seen by others. During the 18 months throughout which my informant had an opportunity of witnessing this phenomenon, and of hearing it through others, no example came to her knowledge of the appearance of the figure at any considerable distance, as of several miles, from the real person. Sometimes it appeared, but not far off, during their walks in the neighborhood. More frequently, however, within doors. Every servant in the house had seen it. It was, apparently, perceptible to all persons, without distinction of age or sex. It will be readily supposed that so extraordinary a phenomenon could not continue to show itself for more than a year in such an institution without injury to its prosperity. In point of fact, as soon as it was completely proved, by the double appearance of Mademoiselle Sagee before the class, and afterward before the whole school, that there was no imagination in the case, the matter began to reach the ears of the parents. Some of the more timid among the girls, also, became much excited, and evinced great alarm whenever they happened to witness so strange and inexplicable a thing. The natural result was that their parents began to scruple about leaving them under such an influence. One after another, as they went home for the holidays, failed to return. And though the true reason was not assigned to the directors, they knew it well. Being strictly upright and conscientious men, however, and very unwilling that a well-conducted, diligent, and competent teacher should lose her position on account of a peculiarity that was entirely beyond her control, a misfortune not a fault, they persevered in retaining her, until at the end of 18 months, the number of pupils had decreased from 42 to 12. It then became apparent that either the teacher or the institution must be sacrificed. And with much reluctance and many expressions of regret on the part of those to whom her amiable qualities had endeared her, Mademoiselle Sagee was dismissed. The poor girl was in despair. Ah, the 19th time! It is very, very hard to bear. When asked what she meant by such an exclamation, she reluctantly confessed that previous to her engagement at Neuvelka, she had been teacher in 18 different schools, having entered the first when only 16 years of age, and that on account of the strange and alarming phenomenon which attached to her, she had lost, after a comparatively brief sojourn, one situation after another. As, however, her employers were in every other respect well satisfied with her, she obtained in each case favorable testimonials as to her conduct and abilities. Dependent entirely on her labor for support, the poor girl had been compelled to avail herself of these in search of a livelihood, in places where the cause of her dismissal was not known, even though she felt assured from experience that a few months could not fail again to disclose it. After she left Neuvelka, she went to live for a time in the neighborhood with a sister-in-law who had several quite young children. Thither the peculiarity pursued her. Mademoiselle de Guldenstube, going to see her there, learned that the children of 3 or 4 years of age all knew of it, being in the habit of saying that, quote, they saw 2 Aunt Emilies, end quote. Subsequently, she set out for the interior of Russia, and Mademoiselle de Guldenstube lost sight of her entirely. That lady was not able to inform me whether the phenomenon had shown itself during Mademoiselle Sagee's infancy, or previous to her 16th year, nor whether, in the case of any of her family or of her ancestors, a similar peculiarity had appeared. I had the above narrative from Mademoiselle de Guldenstube herself, and she kindly gave me permission to publish it, with every particular of name, place, and date. She remained as pupil at Neuvelka during the whole time that Mademoiselle Sagee was teacher there. No one, therefore, could have had a better opportunity of observing the case in all its details. We'll continue right after this quick ad break. In the course of my reading on this subject, and it has been somewhat extensive, I have not met with a single example of the apparition of the living so remarkable and so incontrovertibly authentic as this. The institution of Neuvelka still exists, having gradually recovered its standing after Mademoiselle Sagee left it, and corroborative evidence can readily be obtained by addressing its directors. The narrative proves beyond doubt or denial that under particular circumstances, the apparition or counterpart of a living person may appear at a certain distance from that person, and may seem, to ordinary human sight, so material as to not be distinguishable from a real body. Also, that this appearance may be reflected from a mirror. Unless the young ladies who were courageous enough to try the experiment of touching it were deceived by their imaginations, it proves further that such an apparition may have a slight, but positive consistency. It seems to prove also that care or anxiety on the part of a living person may project, if I may so express it, the apparition to a particular spot. Yet it was sometimes visible when no such cause could be assigned. It proves further that when the apparition separated, if that be the correct expression, from the natural body, it took with it a certain portion of that body's ordinary life and strength. It does not appear that in this case the languor consequent upon such separation ever reached a state of trance or coma, or that the rigidity observed at the same time went as far as catalepsy. Yet it is evident that the tendency was toward both of these conditions, and that tendency was the greater in proportion as the apparition became more distinct. Two remarkable peculiarities mark this case. One, that the appearance, visible without exception to everyone else, remained invisible to the subject of it. The other, that though the second figure was sometimes seen to imitate, like an image reflected in a mirror, the gestures and actions of the first, yet at other times it seemed to act entirely independent of it, appearing to walk up and down while the actual person lay in bed, and to be seated in the house while its counterpart moved about in the garden. It differs from other cases on record in this, that the apparition does not appear to have shown itself at any considerable distance from the real person. It is possible, but this in theory only, that if it had, the result on Mademoiselle Sagee might have been to produce a state of trance during its continuance. This case may afford us also a useful lesson. It may teach us that it is idle, in each particular instance of apparition or other rare and unexplained phenomenon, to deny its reality until we can discover the purpose of its appearance. To reject, in short, every extraordinary fact until it shall have been clearly explained to us for what great object God ordains or permits it. In this particular case, what special intention can be assigned? A meritorious young woman is, after repeated efforts, deprived by an habitual apparition of the opportunity to earn an honest livelihood. The other effect is apparent, unless we are to suppose that it was intended to warn the young girls who witnessed the appearance against materialism. But it is probable the effect upon them was to produce alarm rather than conviction. The phenomenon is one of a class. There is good reason, doubtless, for the existence of that class, but we ought not to be called upon to show the particular end to be affected by each example. As a general proposition, we believe in the great utility of thunderstorms as tending to purify the atmosphere. But who has a right to require that we disclose the design of Providence if during the elemental war, Emilia be stricken down a corpse from the arms of Celadon? With this example, in which the number of concurrent witnesses completely precludes the hypothesis of hallucination, I close my list of cases bearing on apparitions of the living. This phenomenon, whatever its exact character, is evidently the same as that which, under the name of wraith, has for centuries formed one of the chief items in what are usually considered the superstitions of Scotland. In that country, it is regarded as a forewarning of death. This doubtless is a superstition, and by the aid of the preceding examples, one may rationally conjecture how it originated. The indications are that during a dream or a trance, partial or complete, the counterpart of a living person may show itself at a greater or less distance from where that person actually is. And that, as a general rule, with probable exceptions, this counterpart appears where the thoughts or the affections, strongly excited, may be supposed to be. In the case of Mary Goff, the type is very distinct. Hers was that uncontrollable yearning which a mother only knows. If I cannot sit, I will lie all along upon the horse, for I must go to see my poor babes. So when the thought of Mrs. E, dying in London, reverted to her infant, then lying in its own coffin. So again, when the Irish clergyman went to dine with his bishop, leaving his wife sick at home, and she seemed to come forth to meet the returning absentee. To the apprentice, the probable murderer, we cannot ascribe what merits the name of affection. But we can imagine with what terrible vividness his feelings and apprehensions may have dwelt throughout the protracted Scottish church service, on the spot where lay the body of his victim and of his unborn child. Less distinctly marked are some of the other cases, as that of Joseph Wilkins, not specially anxious about his mother, the Indiana bridegroom, Hugh, separated but an hour or two from his bride, the servant boy, Silas, gone a-fishing. Finally, Mademoiselle Sagee, with no cause for uneasiness more serious than the fear that her pupils might waste their time and get into some mischief or other. In some of these cases, it will be observed, death speedily followed. In others, it did not. Joseph Wilkins lived 45 years after his dream. Hugh survived his wife. Silas is still alive, a prosperous tradesman. The counterpart of Mademoiselle Sagee showed itself at intervals for 16 years. How much longer, we know not. It is evident that a speedy death does not necessarily follow such an apparition. The reasons why it is in many cases the precursor of death probably are that during a fatal illness the patient frequently foils into a state of trance, favorable, in all probability, to such a phenomenon. Then again, that, in anticipation of death, the thoughts recur with peculiar liveliness to absent objects of affection, and finally, perhaps, that the immaterial principle, soon to be wholly freed from its fleshly encumbrance, as it approaches the moment of entire release, the more readily be able to stray off for a time, determined in its course by the guiding influence of sympathy. But it is evident that the vicinity of death is not needed to confer this power, and that anxiety, arising from other cause than the anticipation of approaching dissolution, may induce it. A tempest aroused the fears of the mother for her son on the Bremen packet. She appeared to him in his cabin, yet both mother and son are alive at this day. In this, as in 100 other cases, the dispassionate examination of an actual phenomenon, and of its probable cause, is the most effectual cure for superstitious excitement and vulgar fears. I'll admit, I have no idea what to think about this case. I don't know if it's true or not, but regardless, it is super unsettling and eerie. And there's a part of me that believes that while it's easy for one person to pass a phony story as true, it's infinitely more difficult for groups of people to do that. After all, for a group to hold a lie, there has to be rock-solid trust and perpetual consistency. Of course, this doesn't necessarily prove anything, but it does leave you with a nagging, lingering feeling that the story of Emilie Sagee and her doppelganger just might be true. What do you think? As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with this lingering question. Did Emilie Sagee really have a doppelganger attached to her? I've shared the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.